I've heard many stories of the horrors of World War I, from the grim tales of the trenches to the bleakness of no man's land. But the story you're about to hear will redefine fear in a way you never expected. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. If you like the story, please subscribe. Corporal Lawrence had always been a bit strange. From the first day he arrived at the trenches during World War I, the other soldiers felt a vague unease around him, though no one could quite explain why. He wasn't aggressive or troublesome, didn't break orders, and fought as well as any other man. Yet, there was something about him that kept people at arm's length. He was a bit odd. It shouldn't have mattered, really, because in the trenches there was hardly anything normal, and if there was, it had nothing to do with life in the mud. Lawrence fought, followed orders, and didn't bother his comrades, and that was all one could ask of a soldier. Yet, there was something about him that created and maintained a distance between him and the others. In the grand scheme of things, it didn't really matter. In a place where the flesh of living men rotted while still clinging to their bones, a little bad atmosphere was hardly a priority for the officers. Lawrence himself handled it the way he always had. That is, by not even noticing it. Just as someone born blind cannot mourn the memory of beautiful colors, Corporal Lawrence couldn't feel sorrow for the lack of company. He mostly sat quietly by himself during the long periods of inactivity that occurred between battles. The enemy trenches only a few miles away had been silent and still for days. The men were both bored and nervous, and no one had the energy to show Lawrence any basic human decency. What weighed on the men's conscience was that they didn't know why they disliked the corporal. He was normal, of average height, with a normal build, and an unremarkable voice. No one had ever heard him raise his voice, whether in anger or joy. The only thing they could latch onto was that he could be a bit strange at times. He would look at someone for a moment longer than was socially acceptable. He slept little and infrequently, and when he did sleep, they would hear him mumbling constantly. If any words could be distinguished from his sleep-talking, they were strange and sometimes disturbing. One private moved to another barracks after hearing Corporal Lawrence mutter his daughter's name and then laugh for a long time. He and 14 other soldiers were sent across the nightmarishly ruined no man's land between their own trenches and the enemy's to scout and, if possible, take over the enemy trenches. Many secretly hoped that Lawrence would get the chance to prove his loyalty to his country by making the ultimate sacrifice for it. It was guessed that he had been sent to the trenches by an officer who simply wanted to get rid of him, rather than because he was any real asset in the field. It was while he was gone, during the 3 days when the men in the trench held their breath, waiting for their comrades, that someone began asking questions, and now many finally felt free to describe their feelings of unease. When they started talking, they realized there had been something strange about him. No one could remember him ever mentioning his home or his family. He never received letters, nor did he send any. He sometimes talked about dreams he had, and could agree when the others talked about what they missed back home, but never with any real emotion. The whispers reached the officers, and they too began to notice questions surrounding the corporal. No one could find his station orders. He had arrived with a reinforcement unit through France, but there seemed to be no paperwork for it. The rest of the reinforcement, a collection of survivors from other units that had been crushed and decimated by the Germans, had never seen him before until he was suddenly thrown in among them the night before their departure. There had been rumors that he brought bad luck. Everyone who had shared a bunk with him had developed trench foot, and the rooms he had been in always smelled damp and sweet, even for a trench. The soldiers who had been sent out into no man's land with Corporal Lawrence neither heard nor cared about these rumors. Not when they were out in the field, where he was just one of many living under the constant threat of being blown up, gassed, or shot at any moment. They had all received their death certificates. The only thing left was the stamp, which could come at any time. They moved quickly and kept a low profile, hopping from crater to crater, silently navigating the puddles and barbed wire that seemed to be the only things growing in the blasted wasteland. After the crouching sprint over the last hill, they jumped into the German trench and were met with silence. There were no Germans, no rifles, only an eerie and oppressive quiet. Well prepared for the possibility of being lured into a trap, the men split up and began to explore the tunnels and corridors of the trench. What they found was anything but reassuring. The trench reeked of mold, sweat, and a strange undertone of rotting fruit. The smell seemed to come from a foul, sticky sludge that clung to their skin and itched, which had seeped into every crevice and crack in the boards. There was something else, too. In their own trenches, they were surrounded by vermin, lice, insects, and rats that were so bold they would try to steal your food even while you were eating it. But here, there was nothing alive, not even a fly. They found a disorderly armory with bullets scattered across the floor and rifles lying in a heap like a game of pickup sticks. A mess hall had been reduced to ruins, with tables and chairs piled in the center, twisted and half burned. Leftover food had been trampled into the ground as if chaos had erupted during a meal. But there was no sign of any living human, or even an animal, as the increasingly nervous soldiers looked around. It wasn't until Private Dixon explored a barracks that the first signs were found. He screamed, then made a gagging sound. He came out of the barracks pale and sweating. They could tell it had once been a human, simply because nothing else that large could have been there. The body lay on the floor, and it covered the entire floor. Its torn-apart limbs seemed to have been smeared and spread across the dirty, packed earth floor. Bone fragments, already yellowing, stuck out at odd angles, like twigs from fallen old tree trunks. The skull was eventually found in an upper bunk, facing out into the room, as if it had been placed there to be forced to witness the sight of its own dead body. In its eye sockets lay something. When they lifted the skull, 10 white, thin bones fell out. Fingers. When they turned the skull over, they saw that the back of its head was crushed and wide open. After that, they found more remains, increasingly grotesque and ominous. 10 severed hands lay in a circle, fingers interlocked in a sandbag-surrounded sentry post. In a tunnel, they found 2 men whose skin resembled leather, their faces so dried out they looked like mummies. Their eye sockets were empty, and their jaws were drawn apart so that their lower jaws rested on their chests. Their clothes had decayed, and beneath them, the trench sludge, oily and frothy, coated their bodies. No one dared even to investigate the latrine after they caught a glimpse through the door. What they saw was that the holes in the bench were overflowing with something that looked like meat. The surface gleamed with nerves. As the soldiers, with trembling voices, debated whether to take over this nightmare trench or flee, Corporal Lawrence found the hole. It was small and cramped, located in an area that had recently begun to be dug out, an attempt to dig closer to the British soldiers' positions. They hadn't even managed to dig a meter before they seemed to have stumbled upon a natural hollow in the earth. The darkness was impenetrable. Private Dixon, sitting and trying to catch his breath after everything he had seen, watched Lawrence poke at the edges of the hole with his boot. Then he crouched down to look in. And then, before Dixon could even make a sound, Lawrence slid into the hole head first. When Private Dixon was questioned about the events later, he could barely describe the 2 minutes that passed while Lawrence was missing. Dixon was a good soldier, so he had rushed forward to try and help his comrade, but he saw nothing, not even when he bent down with his torch to shine light into the hole. The darkness seemed to swallow all light, but he heard sounds, like movement over small stones or gravel. It sloshed and crackled dryly, alternating between sounds that reminded him of the ant hills he had investigated and set on fire as a child. When he called for help, he was overwhelmed by a stench from the hole, a repulsive odor like that of an old apartment where someone had died, but whose cats had continued living, eating, and pissing for weeks. When Dixon was finally joined by others at the hole, he was lying beside it, cold sweat pouring down, coughing and retching. It was then, as they rushed over to help Dixon, that the hand stuck out of the hole. They all froze, and out of sheer reflex, they drew their rifles and aimed at the trembling hand. They shouted for whoever it belonged to identify themselves, and saw another hand reach out, followed by Corporal Lawrence's face. He was battered and covered in the tar-like black sludge, coughing and sputtering as they pulled him up from the hole and laid him on the ground in the trench. Lawrence turned onto his side, bent forward, and vomited up large amounts of the foul, black muck that covered his body. They hesitated at first, unsure if they should even touch him. But when he stopped vomiting, his eyes rolled back in his head, and he seemed to lose consciousness. The men left the trench as quickly as they could. They half-carried, half-dragged Corporal Lawrence behind them as they rushed through the trench, without any thought of protecting themselves from enemy fire, their minds consumed only by the need to escape. When they finally arrived, quicker than they themselves could comprehend, they collapsed into their own trench, falling into sobs. One of the men, known for having killed a German with a brick, lay in a fetal position, crying. The officers quickly moved the 14 men into an isolated chamber, trying to calm them down, or at least bring them out of their hysterical state so they could give a report. If it hadn't been for the genuinely terrified expressions on the men's faces, they likely wouldn't have been taken seriously, and would have been accused of hallucinating or fabricating the story. The officers muttered something about battle fatigue and strange new gas tests to reassure the men, but as the soldiers were carried out, the officers exchanged long, tense glances. Corporal Lawrence didn't have much of a report to give. About the minutes he had spent in the hole, he said hardly anything. He claimed he had slipped and fallen into what might have been an old underground river or possibly a buried latrine. He couldn't explain the sounds Dixon had heard. He simply said he had struggled for a while to climb out and succeeded as soon as the others had arrived. He didn't actually seem too badly off. In fact, he might have been the one who returned from the enemy trench in the best shape. When dismissed by the officers and ordered not to talk about what he had experienced, he responded with a wide, almost sly smile. The corporal seemed to become a new person in the days that followed. He was more talkative. This made the other soldiers long for the earlier time, when he may have made them uncomfortable, but at least had been silent. He talked about how he appreciated life in these cramped tunnels, and about how the processes of creation and decay around him gave him hope. He babbled on about how people used to entertain themselves in the past, saying things that eventually made his comrades threaten to beat him up if he didn't shut his mouth. Lawrence responded with an even wider smile. Private Dixon, who shared the same space as the corporal, told a comrade one morning how he had woken up to see Lawrence standing beside his bed with his eyes open but expressionless. The next day, Dixon was found tangled in barbed wire in the field, with large parts of his body torn open. Not a single soul from that trench survived the war. But it wasn't because they were killed in battle. A few days after Dixon's death, a wave of illness swept through the camp. It was a strange disease, unfamiliar and violent, that seemed to attack the tissue in the men's bodies, corroding it like acid. Men who had gone to sleep healthy woke up with large, open, blackening sores all the way down to the bone. By the time help finally arrived at the trench, it was too late. A sergeant was found in the latrine, his body covered by a mass of rats. The rats wouldn't release their grip on him, even when shot at. Instead, they attacked. Most of the men wasted away long before they even made it to a hospital bed. Corporal Lawrence survived the plague and ended up in a field hospital in France. At first, he was placed in a hospital where he received several reprimands and complaints. It seemed he was losing his mind. He muttered and talked to himself, whispering about endless darkened corridors, being chased by something in the darkness, and violence. He was diagnosed with shell shock and largely ignored, but his strange behavior culminated in him attacking a nurse, injuring her so badly that she had to have 3 fingers amputated and became blind in one eye. He was swiftly and quietly transferred to France. He disappeared several times from the field hospital, only to reappear hours later as if nothing had happened. When questioned about where he had been, he would begin singing "My Bonnie Lies Over the Sea" in a monotone voice over and over again until the doctors gave up and left. Other patients at the hospital fought to be moved out of the room where Lawrence was staying. A dank, musty humidity seemed to follow him, and people near him occasionally contracted infections and illnesses similar to the ones that had broken out in the trench. Several attempts were made to transfer the man to another field hospital, but they were met with confused bureaucratic bewilderment. Lawrence couldn't be found in the records. There was nothing about when he enlisted, nothing about where he had previously been stationed, or what he had done in the field, not even a birth certificate. He simply sat cross-legged on his bed for hours. He would hum to himself, or recite the names of the other patients in the hospital. Sometimes he would chuckle softly and cheerfully. Corporal Lawrence and 18 other men disappeared from the hospital one November night during the 5-minute shift change between nurses. The empty room reeked of rust, oil, mold, and decay. On the beds, they found thick, black patches of sticky sludge, which seemed to have eaten into the walls and floor. There was no trace of the men, at least not at first. While searching, one nurse suddenly let out a panicked scream after moving a bed. Underneath it, they saw a perfect circle made up of what appeared to be hundreds of teeth. The corporal was never found, nor were any of the others. The story of him and the missing people in his wake was swallowed by the constant flood of nightmare tales from the front and was eventually forgotten. But rumors spread in the trenches of a place cursed by misfortune, where people died in strange ways and where they disappeared, only to be found days later, alive but twisted and destroyed in ways beyond imagination. Stories of a grotesque, dark figure haunting the bombed ruins of Europe. Such rumors spread in the trenches, though they were often quickly silenced, as such stories were thought to bring bad luck. If you found this story chilling and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Stay curious and keep an eye out. You never know what might be lurking in the dark.